Everyone, my name is Elizabeth Chung, and I'll be doing the Debate Hotline February topic lecture. The topic is resolved. The Federal Trade Commission should establish a federal regulatory framework for sports betting. Just for a couple definitions, let's focus on what we have highlighted and bolded in the definition here, in the resolution here. First of all, we have the Federal Trade Commission, also known as the FTC. This is a U.S. government agency which works to prevent forms and acts of fraud and prioritizes consumer protection. That gives us a couple clues here on what the topic is specifically asking for. Because it's a U.S. government agency, this means that whatever it implements has to be implemented world or nationwide, which means it has to apply to all 50 states plus other areas that the U.S. controls. But not only that, we know that this means it takes away from state legislation. Additionally, the FTC has been in charge of things like the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Sheraton Act, things like that, which are really important to prevent fraud and acts of misadvertisement and things like that. It's very good for consumer protection. The second thing that we have in the resolution is a federal regulatory framework, which is essentially just a system of rules and guidelines to ensure that compliance and evaluation of broader impacts of regulations happen. And this is implemented also by the U.S. federal government, which is another indication that it's a nationwide level. The last thing that we're going to be talking about is sports betting, which is just gambling that involves wagering on sports. Pretty simple, like the name suggests. Let's talk a little bit about FTC history. First of all, the FTC Act, or the Federal Trade Commission Act, was implemented in 1914, and it created the agency, and the goal was to prevent unfair methods of competition. Second of all, when this act was created and when the organization was created, they also created the Clayton Antitrust Act, which worked along the FTC Act to restrict mergers and practices that lessen competition. So this just made it more difficult for companies to merge companies and get rid of competition. Then there was the Wheeler-Leah Act in 1938, which amended the FTC Act to prohibit unfair or deceptive acts or practices, which broadened consumer protection. It just made sure that there was less misadvertising and less deception and things like that. Then there was the Cigarette Rule Statement of Basis and Purpose Act, which happened in 1964, and this was just a way to determine what was considered unfair practices, and it was established with 3 criteria. The first was whether practices violated public policies or common law. So, example, was a practice against the law or illegal? The second was that if it is legal, is it immoral, unethical, or unscrupulous? And the third is whether it causes substantial injury to consumers. So 1, is it illegal or is it legal? 2, if it is legal, is it unethical or is it immoral? And 3, if it is technically moral, does this cause injury to consumers and is it unfair for consumers? And this is what they would use in order to determine if advertising was deceptive or not. Then there was the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act in 1975, which provided the FTC with authority to create specific rules for consumer products and industry practices. It just gave the FTC a little bit more power and a little bit more specificity. Then there's the Hart-Scott-Rodino, or known as the HSR Act, which is established in 1976. This establishes the pre-merger notification program, which allowed for the review of acquisitions before they occurred. So really quickly, what is merging or an acquisition? It essentially just involves the acquisition of one's company shares by an acquirer that makes an offer to shareholders. So whether a company is able to give their shares to an acquirer easily or not, and how difficult that is can protect consumers and things like that. Then there was the Federal Trade Commission Improvements Act of 1980, which restricted some of the commission's authority regarding unfair competition. Then there was the Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act of 2003, also known as FACTA, which enhanced consumer rights regarding credit reporting and identity theft. So this was specific to credit cards getting stolen and things like that, which was a rising issue in the 2000s because of the prevalence of credit cards. Then a couple more recent and modern acts. There was been enforcement of modern statutes, including the Informed Consumers Act, the Take It Down Act, which was an act to prohibit non-consensual online publications of intimate visual depictions of individuals, either both AI or human generated, like deepfakes, or sex tapes, things like that. It just prevented things like revenge porn from being posted that were very harmful to a lot of women and a lot of people that were getting targeted. Then there was the Protecting Americans' Data from Foreign Adversaries Act of 2024. A couple of previous legislation acts specific to sports betting are a couple of these. First of all, there was the House Bill 74, which was the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, also known as PASPA. This was a pretty important act because this is what established sports betting to be illegal, and this was created alongside the Senate Bill 474, and both of these were signed into law in 1992. This eventually led to the rise of illegal offshore sports betting because people still had the incentive to do it. They just had to switch where they're doing it, and this happened on something known as Mosaic, which eventually became Netscape. In 1990, the National Gambling Impact Study estimated that the scope of illegal sports betting actually rose to be around $80 to $380 billion. So the market was extremely large for sports betting. It just happened to be illegal now. In 2001, the Amateur Sports Integrity Act is introduced, but it doesn't make it out of committee. This act was aimed at banning betting on college sports, including in Nevada. In 2006, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act was put into place, and then in 2011, a lot of voters, especially in New Jersey, wanted sports betting to be illegal. They didn't like the PASPA law or the PASPA Act, so what they did was they signed a referendum, or they supported a referendum to legalize sports betting, which was then signed into legislation in 2012 by the New Jersey governor. However, he is sued multiple times by the NCAA and other sports organizations that didn't want sports betting. In 2018, SCOTUS actually struck down PASPA, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. This case was known as Murphy versus the NCAA, and this ruling hinged on anti-commandeering doctrine. Essentially, what the Constitution says is that the Constitution gives federal government powers and can prohibit states from having certain powers. For example, like declaring war, things like that. Obviously, the federal government has certain powers, but the federal government cannot commandeer state legislation. This is what this case is talking about. It just says that the federal government doesn't have rights over legislation for sports betting, and that should be state controlled. Which is why after this specific ruling, the case opened the pathway for state-controlled sports gambling. So states were now in charge of legislation for creating laws and regulations for sports betting and sports gambling. Currently, there are 38 states, plus DC and Puerto Rico, which offer legal sports betting. 30 of these states have online sports betting on apps, and the states listed below that are these states where there are no sports betting. A couple big states are like California, Minnesota, South Carolina, Texas, states like that. Some of these states are looking towards getting sports betting legalized, but haven't done it yet. For example, I know Minnesota has been really eager to try and get sports betting legalized, but they just haven't been able to do it yet. So here's how sports betting manifests. There's straight bets, which are things that are very simple type of bets, like money lines. This is just a straightforward bet on which team or player wins outright. There's point spread, which you're wagering on the margin of victory, so how much a team wins by. And then there's over and under, which is just betting on whether the total amount of points earned by both teams is over or under a set number that you bet on. There are some more advanced bets known as combination bets, and a couple examples of these are like parlay, which are just essentially multiple straight bets linked into one, and all of them must be won to get a payout, and one loss just nulls the entirety of the bet. Then there's teaser, which is similar to parlay, but it allows for adjustments mid-bet, which typically leads to a lower payout because there's lower risk. Then finally we have Kalshi, which is a federally regulated prediction market. It says that it functions as an exchange market, so similar to like trading stocks, but it happens for events like sports. But it essentially is very similar to sports betting. It's regulated by the Commodity Futures Trading Commissions, also known as the CFTC, and it operates in all 50 states. So it's legalized across the entirety of the nation. Kalshi has received a lot of backlash, especially from states, as 7 states have sent cease and desist letters to the company, but judges have typically ruled in favor of Kalshi, which is why it's still able to operate today. It's also available to anyone over 21, while sports betting, because it's known as gambling and registered under gambling, is typically only for those over 21. Recently, the company announced a partnership with IC360, which is an integrity monitor, in March, and this was just to make sure that their app wasn't being corrupted, things like that, because that was a really big issue that companies and states were worried about. So let's move on to some argument ideas. First, let's talk about the pro. The first most intuitive argument I could think of was the economy, right? And FTC revival. So here's how the uniqueness would go. It would just say that current sports betting leads to monopolization, credibility crises, excessive business controls, and currently the economy is going to hell because of it. You could say about how we're losing tax money because a lot of it is spent on illegal gambling, things like that, or gambling is just really bad. The link is then that the app revitalizes FTC jurisdiction and influence, which is key to enforcement of like things like antitrust consumer protection laws, things like that that make it easier for them to regulate where money is going and make sure that money is going to the correct places, which is better for the economy. There are a couple turns to this, because you could just say that people going to illegal sports betting is probably worse, because it leads to an increase, like the taxes definitely go somewhere else because of that. It just leads to harder tracking. So it's just an idea of where the money actually starts going after the AF. Then there's something known as insider trading, which is just when people create insider deals within gambling apps or sports betting. And usually a lot of insider trading money fuels organized crime. The app creates regulations which stop inside trading from happening, which therefore stops the money fueling organized crime. Otherwise, organized crime can probably spill over. You could probably garner some link to extinction if you can get a specific group or categorize it more broadly. Or you could keep it just organized crime, something a little bit more down to earth or pragmatic for some lay rounds. Then finally, there's intimate partner violence, which is just that a lot of failed sports bettings leads to domestic violence, and men that gamble, or not men, but people who gamble typically have higher rates of being abusive towards their partners at home. The link is that regulations force companies to increase education. They fund against felons or convicted abusers. They might limit the amount of times that someone is able to gamble. Any restrictions like these can reduce the amount of domestic violence that possibly happens. If you do win this argument in the lay, you probably wouldn't need any framing, but just say that like the lives of these women are incredibly important because of XYZ reason. But if you are talking for a tech round or a flow round, then you should probably have some sort of framing device for your weighing in order to make it really convincing that you win. Otherwise, you kind of get beat out by yourself. So make sure to have some sort of SV or FEM framing in this argument. Let's move on to the con now. The first argument here is cartels, which just essentially says that the AF forces people to turn to the illegal market because the regulations make it difficult to make a proper profit. That fuels cartel violence, increases violence. You can either do, SV framing, because some cartels can target a specific group, or you can just do conflicts increase in general, which probably leads to some form of extinction that you could link to. Again, it's all about the strategy you want to go for and what you're most comfortable doing. The second argument is indigenous populations. So, for example, a ton of indigenous reservations are given solid exclusivity rights for gambling right now. If you see, in a lot of casinos are owned by indigenous reservations and indigenous populations, and that is a big part of their livelihood. The app probably would hurt casinos and other sports betting operations which are uniquely owned by indigenous people, and would probably hurt them. That hurts profit, jobs, surrounding companies, and communities. So you could probably use some sort of SV framing or weighing here as well. I know that there is a pretty big turn on this. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but you could probably look into that. Finally, like we talked about earlier, there is Kalshi or prediction markets. So just post-AF, users switch to Kalshi, which is less regulated. As we've established before, Kalshi is available to anyone over 18, where gambling is for only those that are over 21, which just increases the amount of gambling. There's less regulations because Kalshi is a newer app that the government doesn't really know how to deal with. So you can kind of co-op all impacts to just gambling is bad. Something like IPV going up, something like taxes going to the wrong spot, violence, anything like that could be just co-opted and uses some as a turn. This could be an argument, but you could also just include a lot of those impacts in your own data and contextualize how that would go up, because Couch is less regulated. Other than that, there aren't any arguments. Let us know if you have any other questions, though. Feel free to reach out to the debate hotline website or any of our wonderful instructors. And thank you so much for tuning into the February topic lecture.